Simran, thank you for being here.
For sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm excited for this.
Yeah, of course. I have to say, I am super excited for this. Honestly, also a little nervous. I think this is one of the conversations that I'm the most excited for, but also nervous because I don't have a depth of knowledge when it comes to Seek. And when I was looking you up and doing a lot of research, I was like, man, all of this stuff is very interesting in somewhere where I don't feel like I have a whole lot of depth of knowledge. So I'm really excited for today's conversation and for our listeners. So,
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. And I know this is like the kinds of stuff, specifically, where I come from and the tradition I practice is new for a lot of people. But I know in general, like in this country, we don't talk so much about, religion, and we don't really know how to approach it sometimes. So I'm excited to.
yeah, religions and politics, right? The two things you can never bring up at dinner room
Exactly.
conversation.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we like starting with this Cape U exercise. There's three things. So you can pick. You can do one short response to any of these, or you can respond to all of them. Just pick. I'll go first. It can be one thing about your younger self, one thing you like about your culture, or something unique about you. So I'll go first. And one thing that I like about my younger self, or maybe unique about me, is I really like poetry. And one of my favorite poems is by Langston Hughes. And it was a response to a poem called I Hear America Singing. And the poem that I really respond to is I Too Sing America, which was this beautiful response to this poem that essentially talked about what it was to be in the American dream and feeling like he was left out. And, one of my favorite lines that always stuck out to me is he talks about kind of the idea of being ignored when company comes, being sent to the back room to eat and grow strong. But he kind of ends it with saying, tomorrow I will be at the table and they'll be aghast because they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. And I thought it was such a beautiful, and I think it came to me at a time where I really was struggling with my identity and anger and like feeling like nobody understood what I was going through or what it was to be black in America. And I feel like those words really, really spoke to me. I cried the first time. The first time I read it, it was just a beautiful poem, but it's fantastic. And with that said, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say, I'm a huge Langston Hughes fan. I'm so excited that you said that. So that'll be my share too. So I didn't really hear about Langston Hughes until college, and then I took a course on the Harlem Renaissance,
Yeah.
and then through the Harlem Renaissance course, I took a seminar on Langston Hughes, and I just fell in love with his poetry. I mean, everything, even now. I mean, it's one of those things where like what he was writing about 100 years ago, but everything he says is still true. And so, I mean, there's something about our society and what progress looks like, some of the things we struggle with. But he had this ability to just say things in ways that were so simple and clear, and you would hear it and you'd be like, oh hell yeah, like that's exactly what I feel, but nobody's ever said that before. And I just remember thinking like, how could it be that this guy, what, 80 years ago then, but 100 years ago now, how could he be sitting there and having the same feelings and experiences that I do sometimes? And how can he say them better than me? Like, it's such a gift. So yeah, I'm a huge Langston Hughes fan. So I'm excited that you shared that.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's funny. I love that you love Langston Hughes too. I ran into it in college as well, in Harlem Renaissance. I had a class on Harlem Renaissance, W.B. Du Bois, all that era of stuff that I read, and he was one of the ones that stood out. I remember we read a poem, obviously, in class, or like had an assignment where we had to read a couple, and literally as soon as I read it, I went out and bought like his collection
Yeah.
of poems and just
Same,
sat
yeah.
down and read them all. It was
That's so
fantastic.
cool.
It was
Yeah.
fantastic. Well, with that said, I think that's a beautiful segue into kind of, it feels like we haven't come that far, right? Like we just talked about Langston Hughes speaking a message that seemed like 80 years ago, right? To today. Talk to me about that. Like what is the landscape right now, and why does it not feel like we haven't gone very far?
Yeah. It's funny because like on the one hand, it does feel like we've made a lot of progress, and things have definitely changed, right? Like we had the civil rights movement, we have all sorts of movement and um, changes that help us see um, societally, that help us see one another differently, treat one another differently. And like, as a historian, that feels good. Like that's really important to recognize. And in some ways, I don't think we celebrate it enough. And then at the same time, and I say this also as a historian, like our tendency to assume that as time moves forward, we are also moving forward socially and politically. Um, like that doesn't ring true for me. Like there are so many moments historically where we've taken big steps backwards and struggled with things that I thought we might have already figured out, and it feels like we're in one of those moments of regression where, I mean, honestly, it's hard for a lot of people in this country right now um, to do that really simple thing that Langston Hughes was talking about, and the simple thing that I talk to my little kids about, which is like, be nice to people and and see their humanity and
Yeah.
treat them well, and don't be a jerk. And like it's all at the end of the day like a simple singular message, and for whatever reason, like it feels like we're spinning our wheels, it feels like we're going backwards, it feels like it's like, what's that, like you're banging your head against the wall and
Yeah.
like not getting anywhere. And so um yeah, it's both, and it's like, um it's good and it's positive, and we can celebrate it, and at the same time it's just so frustrating. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's how I see it right now.
I think it's such a beautiful thing you said, because I think for me, I do think I don't celebrate enough how far we've come, the strides we've made, and some of the things that I don't have to deal with, that my grandfather or my father had to deal with, that now are better for me. But I think there's something you said in there that I think is so beautiful, and I wonder if you're quoting or talking about Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where he talks about the concept of time, and that time isn't secular in nature, that good isn't guaranteed to win. It's that it's an action, right? That you have to engage in that change in order for it to move. So I think that's something that's very beautiful. How can people, our listeners, engage in that change, right? That, because I think it's easy to look back and see a lot of times Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement and feel like, okay, what's left, or even to acknowledge, wow, I think it is really important. I'll just use women as an example. I think it is really important that women are paid fairly and experience, the workforce in an equitable way. How can people engage in that?
Mm. Yeah, there's so much we can talk about, and people like us talk about these things all day, every day, and so it's like, um, talk is cheap sometimes. It feels like, and as I'm thinking about Langston, and I'm thinking about Dr. King, and I was reading that letter for a seminar just last week, and absolutely, it's on my mind. One of the things I see in people like them, like just like luminaries, is also this thing that we don't do so well right now. And I'll say this like in a way that's kind of a direct critique of the effort, and that is, we're so focused on making social change, which I think is crucial, right? Like that's what the game is right now. But we're focused on systems and institutions, and how do you change culture? How do you change the environment? How do you change the conversation? How do you make sure, all these big macro level things? And so often the thing we totally forget is sitting right in front of us, right? It's ourselves. And I look at people who are like the transformative leaders who are actually effective in making this change, who are able to speak in a way like Langston, like Dr. King, who they were able to speak in a way that like captured truth, because I think they were in tune with truth in a way that a lot of us aren't, right? Where like it's very momentary, it's what's hot right now. Let's use a bunch of buzzwords, right? Like that's kind of how we
I
how
don't
we
want to be wrong, right? Like I'm interested in this. It's hot right now. I don't want to be wrong, but yeah,
totally,
for sure.
totally. So like to your question, I think it's like what I'm looking at when I'm looking at these figures, and I mean, frankly, I think about this stuff sometimes, but I don't always talk about it in this way. But just like the way that our conversation started, like it seems obvious to me that one really important avenue for change is ourselves. And we might sit here and be like, well, that's not enough and that's not going to change the world. And I think the reality is that's where it begins. And like, you can't really go out there and tell other people what to do if you're not living into it personally, right? That creates hypocrisy and tension, and things fall apart really quickly, as we've seen. So yeah, that's I think where my head is right now in terms of how we drive that change.